So today is the third Sunday of the month, and as usual, there'll be an extended homily. So at the end of the homily, we'll open it up to a discussion, question and answer. So listen carefully to the reading. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Sometime after these events, Jesus again appeared to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. And this is how he did it. When Simon Peter and Thomas, the one known as the twin, were together, along with Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples, Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going to go fishing." "We'll come with you," they said. They went down and got into the boat, but that night they didn't catch a thing. It was already getting light when Jesus appeared on the shore, but the disciples didn't recognize that it was Jesus. "Lads, have you caught any fish?" Jesus asked them. "No," they replied. He said to them, "Cast your net on the right side of the boat and you'll have better luck." They did as he instructed them, and now they couldn't haul it in for the large number of fish. The disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Master." When Simon Peter heard it is the Master, he tied his clothes about him and jumped into the water, for he had been naked. The rest of them came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. They weren't far from the land, only about 100 meters offshore. When they got to the shore, they saw a charcoal fire burning with fish cooking on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you just caught." Then Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net full of large fish ashore, 153 of them. Even though there were so many of them, the net did not tear. Then Jesus said to them, "Come and eat." None of the disciples dared to ask, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Master. Jesus then came and he took the bread and he blessed it and he gave it to them and he passed the fish around as well. This was now the third time after he'd been raised from the dead that Jesus appeared to his disciples. A gospel inspired by God. When your world falls apart and you're living in a nightmare and you need to somehow ground yourself in some kind of reality, the best thing to do is to go back to what you know best and to go back to doing what you do best. And that's the story of the first few weeks after the resurrection, after the death of Jesus and the resurrection. And so the story we just read in John's Gospel this morning is a story about people whose lives had just totally fallen asunder. Everything they dreamed of had turned into this nightmare. Jesus, who was going to become the Messiah and the ruler of Israel, is executed like a common criminal, and they themselves are hunted. So I wonder what it was actually like for the disciples for the first 2 or 3 weeks after Jesus had been killed. Firstly, they hide themselves away in Jerusalem until the smoke clears, and then they sneak back all the ways up to Galilee. And I wonder, did they go to synagogue the next Saturday? Or were they afraid to show their faces? Were they afraid that they were going to get criticized or handed over to the Romans because they were part of his entourage, or just sneered at or pitied? So did they go to synagogue, or did they just kind of hide out together? At this stage, there is no Jesus movement. There's no organization, there's no theology, there's no liturgy, there's no ritual. There's just a bunch of people cowering together and being held together by a common dream that had become now a common nightmare. And so in today's story, they do exactly what I would advise them to do as a psychologist. When your world crashes around you and you don't know which end is up and life is a nightmare, go back and just do the stuff that you do best. And that's exactly what they did. There are 11 disciples of the inner 12. There's 11 left at this stage. Judas allegedly has committed suicide. And 9 of those 11 are fishermen. And so they finally decide, What are we going to do? These are guys who had literally, they'd left their trade, they'd left their profession 3 years before, and they became full-time nomads, full-time itinerants with this Jesus of Nazareth. They'd abandoned their professions, and now their dream was gone. The nightmare had happened. What are they going to do? And so in today's story, Peter says, well, guys, I know about you, but I'm going to go back to being a fisherman. It was the end of the dream. And the other guys, they didn't know what they're going to do. And they said, you know what? Can't think of a better plan. We'll go with you. They're all fishermen anyway. And they go down, they get into the boat, and they spend the night fishing. And then they have this extraordinary experience with Jesus. And so when everything else fails and life is a nightmare, the way to ground yourself is just go back to know what you know best and what you do best. And that's what I'm going to talk about this morning. I'm going to make 3 main points this morning. I'll talk about resurrection. And then secondly, I'll talk about moccasin walking. And then thirdly, I'll talk about Jesus' gallop pole. So the first one is resurrection. One of the things that, if you read the Gospels carefully, you discover there's something very, very strange about Jesus' resurrection appearances. So at the beginning of this story, even though they see Jesus on the shore, they have no idea who he is. Only John finally recognizes him and says, it's the Master. But then at the end of the passage, there's a very, very strange statement where it says, nobody dared to ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Master. Now, why did John put that phrase in? If they knew it was the Master, why would he even put the phrase in, nobody dared to ask him who he was? Because their way of knowing who he was very different from their way of knowing whom he had been. So there's something really familiar about him, and there's something really different about him. And so every single appearance is accompanied by this real kind of a shimmer. Is this he? Is it not he? So the very first person to whom he appeared, according to all the Gospels, was his beloved Mary of Magdala. And he has an encounter with her, the first person to come to the tomb to try to anoint the body. The body could not have been anointed on the Friday evening because in the Hebrew calendar, the day begins at the sunset, what we would call the day before. So 6 p.m. if the sun goes down, that's the beginning of the new day. So 6 p.m. on a Friday, as the sun goes down, is the beginning of Saturday and the Sabbath. So they weren't able to wash Jesus' body. When they took it down from the cross, they did not have time literally even to wash it and to anoint it for burial. Because to wash and anoint it would mean doing servile work on the Sabbath, and that was totally verboten. So they couldn't even wash the body. They had to hurry it immediately into the tomb before the sun set. And so the plan was, as soon as the Sabbath was over, which would be early on the Sunday morning, they'd go back out, and now they'd try to wash the body properly and anoint it for a decent burial. So Mary is the first one out. And the tomb is open when she arrives. She's amazed. The huge big stone has been rolled back, and the body is gone. And she's absolutely heartbroken. She assumes that not only have they killed her beloved, they have now stolen the body as well. She doesn't even have a body to weep over. And she's crying outside the tomb, and Jesus himself appears to her. And they have a dialogue, and she does not recognize him. She thinks he's the gardener. So what is different about Jesus? That even his beloved Mary did not recognize his physical form. Didn't even recognize his voice. The only time she recognized it was when he pronounced her name, when he said Mary. Now, it wasn't, I believe, so much that he pronounced her name, which would have been Miriam, in Hebrew or Aramaic, but that he pronounced her sacred name, her secret name. He pronounced the name of her soul, and that's what she recognized. But she didn't recognize his physical form. She who had been closest to him for this entire period. So what was different about Jesus? That same evening, according to Luke's Gospel, there were 2 disciples walking from Jerusalem to a little village called Emmaus, which would have been about maybe a 2-hour safari. And they're joined by this stranger who says to them, what are you talking about? And they say, are you the only guy in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's been happening here in the last few days? And he said, what happened? You didn't hear about Jesus of Nazareth, that we thought was going to be the Messiah, and now he got crucified? And the stranger says, no, tell me about it. So they begin to tell him about this story. And of course it's he. And so then he begins to open up the scriptures to them and says to them, didn't you realize that this is what was predicted? It would happen exactly this way? And for 2 hours they walk together, and he's explaining the scriptures to him, and they have no idea who he is. And they come to the village, and he pretends he's going to go on, and they say, stay the night with us, eat with us. And he agrees to eat with them, and they sit down at a table, And he takes the bread and the wine, and he breaks it, and he blesses it, and he gives it to them, and immediately they recognize him. It was the Eucharist that allowed them to recognize him. So for Mary, it was her name. For these other disciples, it was the Eucharistic celebration. That's what allowed them. So how could they be with him for 2 hours, listening to this guy whom they'd listened to for 3 years, walking side by side with him, and still not recognize him? And we get the same story this morning. So what is it about the post-resurrected Jesus that they did and they didn't recognize him at the same time? Now, part of the key is the verb that's used in the Greek. The New Testament is written in Greek. And there are many different translations. In different versions of the Bible, we're told that Jesus revealed himself after his resurrection, or he showed himself to his disciples, or he appeared to the disciples. So there are a few different English translations of the Greek verb. But the Greek verb really has the sense of he chose to make himself visible to. So it's not like this was a videotapable event. It's not like if Jesus appeared, standing next to this little table here, and we're all looking in the same direction, that every one of us is going to see him. The verb has the sense of he chose to make himself visible to. So only those who were somehow in the right wavelength were actually able to form the impression of his physical presence there. And so not everybody was going to see him. So very possibly in a huge crowd of people, as they're looking, some will see and some won't see. You get this happening again and again and again. You get all the great, for instance, Marianist apparitions. You get, say, the Fatima event or Medjugorje event, and only these kids can see the Blessed Mother. And there's, in the case of Fatima, there are 70,000 people present on the last occasion, which was October 13th, 1917. There were 70,000 people present with these little 3 kids, and she's appeared 6 times every month for 6 months on the 13th day of the month. And only the kids can see her, and nobody else can. They're all looking in the same space. Nobody can see her except the 3 kids. So what is this about? Does it mean that the kids are hallucinating? Or that the people who thought they saw Jesus were hallucinating, and the people who didn't see Jesus were in their right minds? Or is there something about the way in which he appeared, the level of body he was inhabiting, and the mindset that allowed them to break through? So typically, human vision can only see in the range of infrared to ultraviolet, 300 to 700 nanometers. We can't see below 300 or above 700. We can't see below ultraviolet or above infrared, below infrared, above ultraviolet. And so our vision, our physical vision, is very, very limited. If we could extend that, will we then be able to see Jesus in such an encounter? Or does it have to do with some kind of a soul set? Is it about a spectrum of physical ability, or is it about a soul's ability to vibrate at the level of which the encounter is happening, so that you really see, much more really than even with your physical vision, you're really seeing, you're having a deep, deep, deep soul encounter with the Master? So why was it that some people could see and some others couldn't see? That there was something about Jesus that was, familiar, and something which was so strange that they didn't at first recognize him. So what is happening here? Now, when the disciples then, pick up their life again, now there will be a Jesus movement. It's only after the resurrection appearances have become frequent, and only after the Pentecost event, when they have these extraordinary transformative experiences of Jesus, only then will there be a Jesus movement. At this stage, there isn't a Jesus movement. There is no organization. There's a small little community of people who had a shared nightmare. That's what's holding them together. But there is no theology, there's no ritual, there's no liturgy of any kind. That will only come slowly by slowly, particularly after the Pentecost event. And as I've said to you many, many times, truth for me is not factoid. Something can be factual but not true, and something can be true but not factual. The truth for me is that which transforms me and aligns me with source. A mere factoid does not transform me. The fact that it's now whatever time it is, 10:15 on Sunday morning, that's a fact, but it's not true. In the sense, so what? So if it's 10 or 10:10, what difference does it make? It's just a factoid. It's not a transformative piece of data. So something is only true if it transforms me and it aligns me with source. And something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with source. And so these Eucharistic encounters, or these post-resurrection encounters, were radically transformative, and therefore they were absolutely true. Now the problem is, how do the people who are having these radically transformative experiences, how do they go back and explain it to other people who hadn't witnessed it? And they're kind of stuck. How do you show it? How do you prove it to people? So in the biblical literature, they come up with two different kinds of images. And the Bible scholars call them the before-after images and the below-above images. So they're trying to persuade people that the Jesus they encountered after the resurrection was the same Jesus they knew before his death. So the before-after images have to do with the fact they're trying to prove to people it really, really, really was he. It really was he. How can we prove it to you? Well, he ate with us. He even cooked us a meal. He cooked fish and bread for us, and he fed us. He talked to us. We touched him. We heard his voice. So it was really the same guy before and after. But something is very different. He's been transformed in some way. There's something about him which makes him unrecognizable, so that we didn't immediately understand. We walked with him for 2 hours and he spoke to us. We had no idea who he was. You know, he appeared to me at the tomb, my beloved, and I thought he was the gardener. We saw him on the shore and we thought that he was just another fisherman giving us directions how to fish. So something has changed. So in fact, we're inside in a room in Jerusalem 3 or 4 days after he died, absolutely scared. We have ourselves locked in the room, and all of a sudden, there he is. No door opened. He just manifested right in the middle of the room. And when the encounter was finished, he just dissolved. And so there's something totally different about him. So he is the same before and after, but there's the below-above images, that there's a total transformation has occurred. He's not just the physical teacher we knew and whose voice we recognized for 3 years. There's something radically has changed. He's kind of, in some senses, his divinity is more obvious to us. So they created these two sets of images. And when you look carefully, what it is, it's another form of the cross. There's the before-after metaphors, and there's the below-above images. So what does it represent? For me, it represents the fact that, before-after is a measure of time. Below-above is a measure of space. And so literally, Christ is the master of the space-time continuum, which is another way putting in modern physics of the universe in which we live. We live in a space-time continuum. Our universe is bounded by the 4 dimensions, 3 of space and 1 of time. And Jesus is master of that. He's the below, above, and he's the before afterwards. Which is interesting because there's another version of the cross that I've shared with you many, many times. I don't believe that the cross is a symbol of torture or death or crucifixion. It's an image of the vertical arm of the cross always represents for me the connection between the transcendent and the immanent, between the sacred and the secular. And the horizontal arm of the cross represents the brotherhood and the sisterhood of all sentient beings. And the intersection point between the vertical and the horizontal is how I discover myself. The you are the intersection between the meeting of the transcendent and the immanent and the brotherhood, sisterhood of all sentient beings. Now, Confucius put this very, very powerfully about 500 years even before Jesus. Confucius said, the self is an illusion created by the sum of your social roles. There is no separate self. The self is an illusion created by the sum of your social roles. And in Confucius' time, there were 5 social roles, what he called the 5 constant relationships. There's the relationship between the emperor and the governed, between the teacher and the student, between a husband and wife, between parents and child, and between elder brother and younger siblings. They're the 5 constant relationships in the Confucian model. And Confucius said, the self, your sense of separate self, is actually an illusion created by the sum of these roles in which you find yourself. Now I would say then, using the same image, that the Christ is the intersection, Christ consciousness is the artifact produced by the meeting of the transcendent and the immanent with the brotherhood, sisterhood of all that is. It is the intersection point between the time piece of the before-after and the space piece of the below-above. So Christ, in a sense, is the illusion, not in the sense that it is not real, but it is what happens when time meets space, or when the transcendent and the immanent intersect with the brotherhood of all sentient beings. And so for me, that's the true meaning of resurrection. And that is why it is so difficult for people to try to recognize what they don't recognize. There's something the same, and there's something very radically different. So that's the first point I'll make. The second point I'm going to call moccasin walking. One of the fascinating things to me about the research into near-death experiences, and at this stage in American history, over 20 million Americans have had near-death experiences. They have been pronounced clinically dead, and then because of modern medical technology, have been resuscitated and have talked about the experience of the near-death. And one of the fascinating aspects of it to me is the life review that happens as part of that process. So as people, rush through this tunnel and they see some kind of light at the end, and then there's some kind of a mentor figure whom they meet and with whom they debrief. And there's a life review where every single significant event of their life flashes before them. But here's the interesting thing to me. They all report that they get to experience each significant event from the perspective of all the players in that particular event. And it's not just they're trying to understand the other person's perspective, it is literally they're inhabiting the other person's moccasins. In fact, it's more than that, because if you put your foot in somebody else's moccasins, you got a different foot from them. So it's not quite the same experience. You got bunions and they don't. If you can walk in their flesh, literally inhabit their heart space, then you would really know what it was like to have the experience that that person had. So the life review consists of the ability to experience from every single perspective what it was like for all of the players in each event to experience that event. Now, moccasin walking then is the ability to inhabit somebody else's perspective. Now, this is something we learn very, very slowly as children. So if I took a book, for instance, let me take this book for a moment. Suppose I showed you a book that had two different covers. So one cover is green and the other color is white. Okay? And I showed this book to a 4-year-old child who knows her colors. And I said to her, "What color is that?" She'd say, "White." "What color is that?" "Green." "What color is that?" "Green." "And this one?" "White." What color am I looking at? A 4-year-old child will say, "Green." Because she can't walk around to my side of the book in her mind and realize that although she's looking at green, I'm looking at white. She can't do that at a 4-year-old child. Literally, the cognitive hardwiring isn't in place to accomplish that. And so the ability to adopt another person's perspective is something that grows really gradually. By age 5 or 6, she'll realize that although she's looking at green, I'm looking at this side, which is white. That happens around age 5, perhaps. Around age 7, a child will develop the ability to reason. And now, when we develop the ability to reason, we can begin to comprehend another person's perspective even better. But until age 12, we're not really perfect at it. Age 12 is the ability to self-reflect. Now we can critique our own performance, our own thinking, our own values, and we can begin to critique the values of our family and the values of our world. And it's at this stage that kids begin to ask really, really tough questions. Why are we bombing Iraq? Stuff like that. Now, this is the stage at which the culture wants to close us down. Every culture attempts to close down children's growth about age 12 because we don't want them to grow beyond ethnocentricity. So they start egocentrically. Every little child is totally self-focused, and we encourage them to go beyond that and to begin to think about the tribe and the welfare of the tribe. So we encourage kids to grow into the fullness of their ethnocentricity. To come into the belief system, it's my country, right or wrong, or the Catholic Church is the only one true church, or there's no salvation except in the Lord Jesus, whatever version of it we have. It's ethnocentrism, where we want to stop the child's growth at the stage where they identify only as no. So every culture attempts to stop a child's growth when they achieve ethnocentricity. We don't want them to go any further than that. We don't want to be able to adopt that, a white kid can adopt the perspective of a black child, or a Protestant child can adopt the perspective of a Catholic child. We don't want to cross these kinds of boundaries. And so this is where we begin to shut people down. And this is where multi-perspectiving or moccasin walking stops. And the truth is, we have to go way beyond ethnocentricity. We have to be able to think as a global human community and walk in everybody else's moccasins. But even that isn't the end of the journey. We have to go beyond even species thinking and begin to think on behalf of all sentient beings not just even on this planet, but wherever life is found in the universe, in whatever dimension it's found, whether it's in physical dimensions or emotional dimensions or totally intellectual, non-physical dimensions, wherever there is life, wherever there is manifestation of the divine, to be able to inhabit that kind of perspective. And so that's the real growth, looking at the viewpoints of others. Now, it does not mean that we have to adopt or agree with the other person's viewpoint, but we have to be able to inhabit it. I have a rule when I'm working with couples in my practice. One of the first things I always do with them is a few sessions on communication skills. And one of the things I say to them, if there's an argument going on between a husband and a wife, one person is not allowed to challenge what the other person has said until they can articulate just as fluently as the person who proposed it what the viewpoint is. So I'll keep going back saying, no, that's not what she said. Ask her. Is that what you said? No, you didn't hear what I was saying. Here's what I said. So until each of them can fully express really well the viewpoint of the other, they don't have the right to challenge it or to confront it. How can you confront something that you haven't heard or listened to or understood? All you're doing is you're just brutalizing the other viewpoint. So the ability to walk around and look at the kind of color the person is looking at their side of the folder is really important. I don't have to agree with it, but I need to learn something from it. If two people who love each other are holding different viewpoints on any topic, it means there's value on both sides of it. So I'm far better employed learning what I can learn from you rather than foisting on you, what I think is right. I'll grow if I can adopt your perspective. I won't grow if I stick just to my own. Even if I only believe that you have 5% of the truth and I have 95%, sticking to 95% is not going to make me grow. Looking at your 5% is going to make me grow. And so multi-perspectiving is a huge part of this exercise. But it does not mean I have to agree or adopt. A few days ago, for a chapter of a book that I was writing, I created a kind of a 2x2 matrix. So I want you to imagine the following thing. Imagine a window pane with 4 quadrants. So there's 2 columns and there are 2 rows. In mathematics, it would be called a 2x2 matrix. So imagine that the first column, we're talking now about behavior. Imagine the first column represents conscious behavior. And the second column represents unconscious behavior. And the first row represents aligned behavior, so aligned with God. And the second row is unaligned or misaligned with God. That's going to give you 4 quadrants. So as you're looking at it, the top left-hand quadrant will be conscious and aligned. So when your behavior is conscious and aligned, it is enlightened behavior. When it is conscious and aligned, it's totally enlightened behavior. If you come across to the next one, the top right-hand quadrant, that is unconscious but aligned. Somebody who's unconscious but aligned is kind of naive or innocent. They're not going to do a whole lot of damage, but they're fairly innocuous because they have no idea why they're doing what they're doing. So even though they're not doing any bad whatsoever, they're not being really, really effective. The next quadrant down would be unconscious and misaligned. When your behavior is unconscious and misaligned, you are shadow possessed. You're being driven totally by forces that you don't understand, of which you're not conscious and of which you're not aware. So you may not do a whole lot of damage, but you're going to be driven constantly by unconscious urges and instincts. And the final quadrant down here would be misaligned but conscious. So if I'm misaligned and conscious, I'm engaging in really evil behavior. Really evil behavior. I know what I'm doing it even though I know it's misaligned behavior. I'm causing all kinds of suffering from people, but that's where I'm located. And one of the exercises I would propose is to look at my own behavior in these 4 quadrants and ask myself, in the course of my day, which of my behaviors are enlightened because they're conscious and they're aligned, and which of them are unconscious and aligned, so they're kind of naive behaviors, and which of them are unconscious and misaligned because I'm shadow possessed, I'm not aware of what I'm doing, and when do I step into the area of doing stuff I know is going to hurt somebody, but I'm going to do it anyway. So it's a really interesting exercise to look at. Which brings me to the third point I want to make this morning. And I'm going to call this Jesus Gallup poll. So it's always fascinated me when I look at the people in the life of Jesus. And as a small child growing up, I'm sure you as well as I thought, if I'd been alive in the time of Jesus, I would have listened to him, I would have followed him, I would have given my life for him because, he was God. So why didn't the people at his time do that? So it's always fascinated me the radically different reactions to this extraordinary teacher, starting with his own family. When he finally began his public ministry at the age of 30, having been a nice, quiet Jewish boy for the first 30 years of his life, a carpenter just like his daddy was, he suddenly decided he wanted to become a rabbi. And the family was deeply embarrassed first, and then they figured out the guy's having a psychotic break. Literally, there's a passage in Mark's Gospel in chapter 3, in verse 21, where when Jesus began his public ministry, we are told, his family came to take him by force because they thought he had gone mad. They literally thought the guy was having a psychotic break. And so they tried to grab him by force, and he refused to go with them. So his family totally misunderstood what he was about. When he finally got established and he was getting a reputation, there's a passage in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 20, verse 20, where his aunt comes to him. His aunt is the mother of James and John. And she takes Jesus aside and she says, I've known you since you were a little kid with your backside out through your trousers. You know, and I know all these boys, I know these 12 guys that are hanging around with you, they're all fine guys, I know them all really, really well. But there's my two sons, James and John, and they're your cousins. So when you come into your kingdom, I want to make sure that one of them is sitting at your right hand side and the other guy is sitting at your left hand side. You got me? And Jesus says, have you any idea what you're asking? And of course she didn't have any idea what she was asking. But her shtick was, now that he was successful, she wanted to make sure her boys were going to be part of the excitement. You look at the rest of the disciples. The rest of the disciples listening to this guy for 3 years, and all they saw was job opportunities. This guy is going to be the Messiah, and I'm going to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and I'll be in charge of finances, and I'll be in charge of education, whatever. They're dividing up the portfolios. That's what they understood of him. You take the mob, and the mob thought he was just an entertainer. You know, he fed them in the desert. He raised the dead to life. He gave sight to the blind. Wow, this is an exciting act. You know, golf hadn't been invented yet, so let's follow this guy. That's what they saw. And whether he was, giving them bread or hanging on a cross, it was just entertainment as far as they were concerned. The religious authorities saw him as a blasphemer. They couldn't see beyond the fact that he was bringing a totally, radically new, different kind of spirituality. And they saw him as a blasphemer. And the Romans saw him as a threat. Jesus came from Galilee. And between 167 BC and 132 AD, that 300-year period, there were 32 armed rebellions against occupying forces in the land of Israel. 32 rebellions. And 31 of the 32 originated in Galilee, where Jesus was from. In fact, the average life expectancy for a Galilean male at the time of Jesus was 29. He actually lived 4 years beyond his kind of life expectancy. 29 was the average life expectancy for a Galilean male at the time of Jesus, because there was this constant revolt. So the Romans just saw this guy, another Galilean with a mass following, snuff him out. So everybody has got this kind of idea of who Jesus is. So it's always fascinated me, how could you encounter a being of this magnificence and not see who he was? So I want to end my presentation before I open it up with a story I wrote in September, 14 years ago, September 1998. I was meditating on this issue really, really deeply. I said, how could they not see who he was? How could they not have been touched, by his compassion and his love and his teaching? How could they have done what they did? And this story came to me, and I'm going to finish by reading the story. I called it, When I Remember Zion. He seemed somehow different, not the normal importunate beggar thrusting a bowl in one's path and clawing with broken and dirt-encrusted fingernails at one's cloak. He seemed almost disinterested in alms, as if it mattered little whether he ate or not. Beggars. It's one of the reasons I don't much fancy these trips to Jerusalem, which are now much more frequent since my father's death and his bequeathing of the family business to me. My recollection of Jerusalem has always been an impressive, incense-clouded temple and a most unimpressive horde of fly-infested mendicants. Walking any of the main streets is a veritable running of the gauntlet. All manner of disfigured creatures obstructing one with mutilated and hideous limbs, cursing earthily if ignored, and grinning ingratiatingly if thrown a coin. Disgusting affair, really. But this chappie was different. Beneath the unkempt beard, emaciated face, and tattered attire, there was a deep and abiding wistfulness. Moreover, I seemed to recognize his face from long ago. I dallied a little too long in pitching my offering into his bowl, and he looked up, sensing that I was perusing him. I knew then that I had met him before. He used to be the synagogue leader in Capernaum, where my father took me to worship each Sabbath when I was a boy. Gathering my robes carefully about me, I squatted before him and asked, "Are you by any chance Jairus, once the synagogue leader of Capernaum?" A look of alarm dilated his grey eyes, so that the whites contrasted sharply with the brown, leather-beaten countenance. I held his gaze relentlessly until he bowed his head in shame and whispered, "I am he." A memory of two noble and dignified men greeting each other each Sabbath flashed across my mind. For my father's sake, I proffered my hand and pulled him to his feet. "Come," I said, "tonight you will lodge with me." We looked a peculiar pair as we made our way towards the inn where I normally lodge. Other beggars eyed him, some with envy, some with admiration at his having found a patron. After the evening meal, we sat by the fire. There were no other guests, and his eyes glazed over as waves of melancholy swept through him. Without any bidding, he turned to me and began to tell his story. "I am Jairus, and I was once the synagogue leader at Capernaum. I was married, and my wife Veronica and I had one child, a girl." At the mention of the child, large tears rolled down his cheeks, and he was unable to proceed for several minutes. We were very happy, my wife and child and I. I was well respected in the community. I loved my wife, and next to my God, I lived for my child. Then, one summer, our child became seriously ill. Nothing or nobody could ease her pain or cool her fever. I brought doctors from Jerusalem and even from Damascus, but having first secured their fees, they all professed themselves unequal to the task of curing her. I became frantic. I declare on my immortal soul that if I thought Baal or Astarte could have restored her to health, I would have offered them sacrifice. One day, when she was at death's door, having been in a coma for 2 weeks, a friend told me that Jesus the Nazarene was in town. Author's note: this Jesus had a sometime reputation as a healer and a prophet, but was executed about 20 years ago for inciting the populace to disaffection against Rome. It was said that Jesus had the gift of curing sicknesses of all kinds, and indeed huge crowds from Galilee and Judea followed him about. Throwing caution and pride to the winds, I rushed out to try to meet him. He had moved on, I was told, and was heading for Cana. I set out after him, and towards evening came upon him and a large concourse of people. I stayed the night there, and early next morning I went to meet him. I was told that he had gone out very early to be alone to pray. I tracked him down, and throwing myself on my knees, I begged him to come and cure my daughter. Here the old man broke down again. Then he said a very strange thing. I wish to God I had never met him, or that he had refused to cure her. It would have been easier to have lost her the first time. There was no sound for 2 minutes but the fire crackling. I thought he would not go on with the story. But finally he pulled himself together and continued. He readily agreed to come, and we started back for Capernaum, hope and fear resting together in the knot that was my stomach. When I got to the street where we lived, the blood drained from my face. In the distance, I could hear the death dirge and the flutes and the synthetic shrieking of the professional mourners. My child, my little girl, was dead. My knees buckled, and I would have collapsed into a heap were it not for the strong grip he took on my shoulder. "Have faith," he said. That was all. Somehow it didn't seem like a pious platitude, We walked on. When we arrived at the house, my wife was sitting outside, gazing into the distance and seeing nobody. She couldn't cry, she couldn't speak, she couldn't even feel. The mourners seemed to be enjoying their work, no doubt. They wanted to impress their employer and be sure of their remuneration. He raised his voice and asked them, "What business have you here? This child is not dead, but sleeping." The caterwauling ceased, and a torrent of abuse took its place. The stupidity of his assertion, coupled with the suspicion that we were trying to cheat them out of their money, lent volume and viciousness to their vitriol. He simply pointed to the front door with such power and authority flashing from his eyes that the entire group, with very subdued mutterings, packed their instruments and hurried out. An eerie silence descended on the house, so intense that it jerked my wife to attention. He said, "Show me where the child is." Veronica led the way. When I saw my little girl lying ashen-faced and cold, her pink lips frozen into immobility, I wanted to swear at God for his cruelty. Then the Nazarene walked to the bed and took the lifeless hand in his. "Little girl," he said, "her eyes." I could not believe it. Her eyes fluttered and opened, and they looked long and intently into his. I could see that he was smiling, and she too began to smile. White pearls in an oyster shell of red. He drew her gently to her feet and said, "Go and greet your mammy and your daddy." Veronica fell to her knees and wrapped her arms about her child, weeping uncontrollably. It was now my turn to be frozen into inaction. When I recovered, it was gone. But I was to meet him twice again, unfortunately. He kicked at a flaming ember that had fallen out of the fire, sighing deeply, and then he continued, "That very week, a letter arrived from Jerusalem. Apparently, one was sent to all the synagogues in Galilee and Judea, warning us about this Jesus, his total disregard for the customs of our ancestors, his flagrant breaches of the Sabbath, and the cures and the miracles which were worked through the power of Beelzebul." Needless to say, I was shocked. Shocked that I had entertained such a fellow. Shocked that the demonic power of him was the reason for my little daughter's vigorous new health. The letter concluded by admonishing all officials that the man, Jesus, was under no circumstances to be invited or even allowed into any synagogue. Anybody disregarding this decree was himself to be banished from the synagogue. I showed the letter to my wife, and as she read it, all hell broke loose. She called the Sanhedrin a bunch of fools and the high priest a blind leader of blind followers. Her voice rose to hysteria, and clasping her bewildered child, she continued, "That man is the anointed of Yahweh. He is everything that Isaiah prophesied he would be, and you, the shepherds of Israel, you want to ostracize him as you did all the prophets? You judges unto darkness. You will sacrifice love and mercy and compassion for stifling man-made precepts. Could you not feel the power and the gentleness of him? Are your male heart and your male head so hard and so dense that you couldn't bathe in the healing and the mercy that radiated from him? Is our little girl not a living proof that Yahweh is with him? Or would you prefer the self-righteous babbling of those dithering, decrepit old fogies in Jerusalem?" At length her hysteria subsided, and she began to plead with me. "Jairus, I beg you, do not bar this holy man from the synagogue. Let him help others as he helped us. You owe him at least that much." But I had made up my mind. "Veronica," I said, "remember that the enchanters of Egypt produced signs and wonders in the sight of Moses and Aaron at the bidding of their Pharaoh. Do not be deceived." With many other passages of Scripture, I showed her how Satan can deceive even the elect. She made no reply, but I sensed that a rift had developed between us, and I was very frightened by it. For 9 whole days, she never spoke a word. On the second next Sabbath, he appeared at the synagogue. But we were ready for him. Tactfully and with as little fuss as possible, I told him that he was no longer welcome. In fairness, he took it like a man. He turned on his heel and wordlessly walked away. Just then, I caught Veronica's eye. She looked at me as if I were a stranger. When I got home that evening, she was gone. So was the child. For 3 days, I was too ashamed to ask anybody if they had news of her. When I did ask, nobody knew of her whereabouts. Pride would not allow me to take it any further. When she has discovered which of us is right about this son of Satan, I thought, she'll come back and beg my forgiveness. With dignity and a certain haughtiness, I continued my duties, ignoring the knowing looks of my neighbours. Months, silent months, soundless, never-ending nighttime months passed, and I went up to Jerusalem to celebrate the Paschal feast. On the Friday before the great Sabbath, as I made my way along a small side street, I found myself on the fringe of an exultant, motley mob of excited citizens and Roman soldiers. They were bringing 3 criminals towards Golgotha for crucifixion, and one of them was the Nazarene. I almost felt pity for him. He struggled under a huge cross, and his face and body were a mess of gaping wounds and sweat and spittle. Suddenly, as he drew near where I stood, a woman burst out of the crowd and ran to him. The soldiers were too surprised to intervene. She held a soft white cloth to his face and ever so gently swabbed and patted the blood, the sweat, and the spittle. His lips formed the words, "Thank you." And then the soldiers prodded him forward with their spears. She turned to follow his progress, and I found myself looking into the face of Veronica, my wife. It was as if she never saw me. Slowly, she turned away and began to walk after him. I was rooted to the ground. When I got control of myself, I too followed the crowd. By the time I reached Golgotha, the crosses had already been erected, and he was hanging grotesquely from the center one. The soldiers kept the mocking, jeering multitude at bay, but a little group of people was standing at the foot of his cross. Veronica was among them, and by her side, her little upturned face, bloated with crying, was my child. I edged nearer and found that she was speaking up to the figure on the gibbet. "Jesus, thank you again for saving my life. If I were a man, I'd fight these soldiers and save your life. I love you, I really do." I would give anything to have her say those words to me, but she never will. I turned and ran from that place, ran and got so drunk that the feast was long since finished when I sobered up. I've never seen my wife since then. I've never seen my child since then. If she is still alive, she's 30 years old now. I've never been back to Capernaum since, and I've never been in a synagogue since. I beg alms within a stone's throw of the temple, but I've never been inside it since. I know not if Yahweh dwells there anymore, and I care less. I have lost my wife, I have lost my child, I've lost my faith, I've lost all hope. Only one emotion survives in me: hatred. I hate that Nazarene who gave my daughter life and took away her love. Would that he had failed to revive her. I would have a tomb to visit, a loving wife for us to comfort each other, and the memory of a tousle-headed child clambering onto my lap. Now there is nothing. He got to his feet, and despite all my protestations and pleadings, disappeared into the night. I never laid eyes on him again. Patricia. Okay. Okay. So Patricia's question is, to which kind of quadrant would I put Jairus? Was he an evil person? I don't believe he was an evil person. I think he would come into the category of misaligned and unconscious, shadow-possessed, that he was so steeped in the cultural trance that he totally believed that what he was doing was right, and that whatever sacrifice he had to make for it, it was justified. So that so many of us, that we are driven by unconscious alignment to the cultural trance of the church we grew up in, or the nation of which we're a part, or the ethnic group to which we belong, and that it's our journey to wake ourselves up to two things: to be fully awake to living consciously, and to make sure that when we live consciously, we're living according to values which are really aligned with God's stuff. They have to be aligned with love and compassion. Anything which results in prejudice or anger against anybody, any species, any person, is misaligned behavior, no matter how much consciousness and awareness I bring to the task. In fact, then, the more awareness I bring to the task, if I'm misaligned, the more damage I do in the world. The misaligned and unconscious do damage. It's shadow-possessed damage. But the ones who are consciously misaligned, they're the ones who create, real problems in our world and in our times. Yeah. Rita.
Is that a judgment on our part to determine? How do we know if someone is misaligned, consciously or unconsciously? It seems like it's one of those lines that is there.
Okay.
I don't know. Can you explain that a little further?
Yeah, it's very, very obvious from behavior. As Christ would have said, by their fruit you shall know them. There's a very, very different energy when you're engaging with somebody who's consciously committed to evil from somebody who's just in possession of their shadow and is acting unconsciously. There's a deliberate intensity to it. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the movie, I can't remember the name of it. It's about professional assassins, kind of mafia types. John Travolta was in it. What's it called? Mesher. Pulp Fiction. And if you see that movie, Pulp Fiction, and there's these two assassins who are doing their job, and they have no anger against the people they're killing. It's just a job, and they kill guys in a whole variety of circumstances. And it's just a job, and they're carrying on normal conversations with each other as they're pumping bullets into the others. So for me, that's the kind of evil which is totally committed to a task. They have no ability to empathize whatsoever. This is their truth. And they're fully aware of it. I'm taking a life, and I'm doing it, and it doesn't mean any difference to me. That's different from a kind of a crime of passion, where somebody is driven by unconscious kind of forces, an addiction, or a prejudice that they've learned from their culture, and they're being driven ahead of it, like surf in front of the wave. But they're not consciously, deliberately evil. There's a very, very different energy that you encounter as soon as you come across these two different types. Very, very obvious. Yeah.
So we almost have to know or experience it.
You can pick it up from. I think you can even pick it up from photographs. And I'm not going to name any names, but there is a past politician in our country right now, and every time I see his face in a photograph, I know that this is a really evil man. I know there are other past politicians who are shadow-possessed, who did some really terrible stuff, nationally and internationally, but there's one character I have in mind, and I'm not going to name him, but there's one character, every time I see this man's face, I know that this is a really evil man. He is totally, consciously, deliberately doing what he's done, and what he continues to do. And it's obvious, even from a photograph. I've never met this person. I can tell immediately from the photograph. Yeah.
I don't have a question. It's though it's frightening to observe a lot of unconscious misalignment, a massive unconscious misalignment. It's very exciting to know that we the cycle of our times is filled with extra boost of energies from Jesus and other masters and our other friends from beyond. to help us awaken and help us realize how powerful each one of us is to spread that energy of joy and gratitude to turn this world around.
Totally. I agree. I do. Beautiful. Beautifully done. So I think there's a morphogenetic field has been set up with the advent of the avatars beginning about 2,500 years ago. And when you look at human evolution, there's this phrase that says, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that the individual journey, reenacts the journey of the tribe. Phylogeny just means the journey of the tribe. And so what it took the human species 3.7 billion years to achieve, your average little baby does it in 9 months in utero. Because so many people have gone through that morphogenetic field, it becomes easier and easier and easier. It speeds up more and more and more. And so I think the great avatars, the Jesus figures, Kung Fu Tzu, Lao Tzu, Buddha, Mahavira, Zoroaster, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, these people, they set up a morphogenetic field of pure love and pure compassion. And as more people walk through that, it becomes easier and easier to access that. And the next stage of human development will see the full blossoming of that piece. I've spoken many times that, at various stages of evolution, a species begins to bifurcate. And it throws up different versions, one of which will survive long term and the other which will go extinct. And we saw it, for instance, the hominids bifurcated, let's say the primates trifurcated into common chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans. And they went in 3 different directions. At some stage, the hominids bifurcated into Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon. So when the bifurcation point happens, it takes time for one group, they're in a cul-de-sac, an evolutionary cul-de-sac, they go extinct. I really believe that for the last 2,500 years, we've been on a bifurcation track between 2 subspecies whom I've called. One of them is Homo spiritualis, which is those dedicated to Christ consciousness or Buddha nature. And the other one is, I've called it Homo sociopathicus. And they're the people dedicated to greed and violence. And they're going to become extinct. Now they'll do a lot of collateral damage until they become extinct, but they will become extinct. And the future of civilization is the kingdom of God will be taken up by Christ conscious beings, and there are more and more of them coming to awakeness. This and then.
So we each have our own personal journey of moving towards conscious alignment. At the same time, you've got people unconsciously misaligned and those that are consciously aligned. Energy-wise, where should we be spending that energy as far as changing that side of the tide or what have you too? From so you have the act of forgiveness, which is out there in your own journey as well. Where do you go with consciously misaligned people, forgiveness, and the energy it takes to stop that?
Yes. I think there has to be 2 courses of action constantly. There has to be a commitment to personal transformation, and there has to be a commitment to the dismantling of dysfunctional systems and the disempowering of evil leadership. But the emphasis is in the personal transformation. And I've used the examples of 2 water projects that I did in Kenya years and years ago. One of which we were delivering poisoned water to the people, and the other which the pipe system itself was dysfunctional, wasn't delivering. And so the pipes represent the institutions, and the water represents the people who staff the institutions. It is very, very difficult to affect, to deliver a good product in leaky pipes. But there's no point in delivering, poisoned product through good pipes. So there has to be the twin emphasis on the dismantling of dysfunctional systems and the disempowering of dysfunctional leaders on the one hand, and the empowering of personal transformation. So the 2 of them have to go on side by side. And it depends on the situation. An image I use sometimes, if I have a vase of flowers on my tabletop, it's filled with water, and my child knocks it over, and the water now is pouring onto the floor. So I got a few different ways I can respond to it. I can take a cloth and I can start mopping up the floor, but it's still discharging water from the table. So there's not a whole point in mopping the floor if it's still coming off the table. There's not even a point in mopping the table if the vase is still spilling it out. So the first thing you need to do is set the vase upright. Second thing, clean the table, which is discharging onto the ground. And then thirdly, clean up the ground. And so in some instances, we have to really put energy into dismantling the dysfunctional system, to pick up the jar, And then we can start mopping up the stuff below. So it depends on the circumstances where in a particular situation, in this instance, the energy needs to go into blocking maybe the election of a really corrupt politician. Or in this instance, it's starting a meditation group. So the two of them have to go side by side, and in every particular circumstance, I have to make the determination, what is the appropriate focus in this particular moment? Is it disempowering the evil, or is it kind of empowering the good? They have to go side by side, but the particular circumstance will dictate just now what's the immediate response for the now. Johanna.
The idea of being able to recognize Jesus, most of us, probably none of us, were there in a past lifetime. Probably none of us have literally been in person with Jesus that we know of. But the idea of recognizing Jesus and Christ consciousness, I think, is an eternal issue within ourselves, because every act that we interact with anyone during our day, we have an opportunity to say Christ is in this person, or even within ourselves, to have mercy on and consciousness in ourselves if we're misaligning, or that it's an eternal task to try and turn towards that consciousness within ourselves all of the time.
Totally.
And the opportunity is there.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
So it's not a question, there's no point in us asking the question, would we have recognized the Master 2,000 years ago if we'd walked with him? In a sense, that's not a very useful question. The question is, where am I not seeing Jesus today, or the Christ consciousness today? And so when I look at people or I look at circumstances, what is it that's clouding my vision? And what's clouding my vision is personal psychopathology and the cultural trance. And so each one of us has to try to dismantle and try to figure out what is really there. So the data are never the things that upset us or make us happy. The data don't make us happy or upset us. Or it's the interpretation we foist on the data. The very same data can have totally different results. It always fascinates me that our Supreme Court, that allegedly the 9 finest legal minds in the country, will divide down 5-4 on most significant issues. If the data of the legal system were obvious, they wouldn't be doing that. They're doing it because they're being driven by their own psychopathologies and the cultural trances. They're not seeing things as things are. They're seeing things as they themselves are. None of us sees things as they are. We see things as we are. So the journey of personal transformation is trying to unearth and pull back all of the filters with which I'm overlaying the data. So what allows me to look at this situation and come to conclusion A, and another person looking at exactly the same situation and coming to conclusion B, which are antithetical to each other. What is accounting for that? And it's always 2 factors: personal psychopathologies, needs, hopes, expectations, fears on the one hand, and the cultural trance on the other. And our job is to peel back all of those so that we allow the data to address us in their core essence. And every one of us is subject to this. There's not a single one of us who's not subject to prejudices and psychopathologies and cultural trances. Coming awake is identifying those elements and trying to kind of peel them off one by one. That's the journey of awakening. And we have to be able to do that with every person. And to call a spade a spade. When somebody is engaged in really evil behavior, we have to be able to confront that. And loving that person is confrontation. I've said to you many times that there are 4 ways to love. There's confirmation, there's compensation, there's complementarity, and there's challenge, the 4 C's. And loving through confrontation is a very important way of loving. And so seeing where there is dysfunction, dismantling it, dismantling dysfunctional systems and disempowering dysfunctional leaders. It's a very important way of loving the people, the institutions, and our world. Karen, and then Chris.
To what extent do you think a person's unwillingness to take responsibility for their decisions and for the way they are, to what extent does that reflect their how much they sort of buy into the cultural trance?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It's almost in a sense, although I've identified it as 2 elements, they're totally woven into the same fabric of our experience of life. So it's very hard to kind of differentiate one. Nobody has ever grown up in a vacuum where they've developed psychopathologies in the absence of cultural indicators or cultural kind of nudging. So we're the product of the cultures which we've created. So it's a cycle. We create our cultures. people living together create their culture, which then, indoctrinates everybody else born into the culture. So to say which is the first cause isn't particularly helpful. It's to be able to say, these are two facets. It's like saying, I got hands and eyes, but they're part of the same body. And so where did the disease begin? Did it be my eye or my hand, whatever? My body is ill, and so no matter where it starts, it's going to affect every part of it. So we have to address all facets of it at the same time. And that's why, in setting up our exploration group, what I really wanted to do was, bring to our attention that the problems we face as a world community, is a hydra-headed monster. We see it in our education systems, we see it in our agricultural policies, we see it in our justice system, we see it in the military, we see it in our media, we see it in the pharmaceutical industry, we see it in our political structure, we see it in our religions. It's a hydra-headed monster. And we must, understand the very, very many different ways in which it breaks out, because it's a systemic issue. By solving the education system on its own, that's not going to end the problem. Or solving, finances, dictating politics, that's not going to solve the problem. That's just one aspect of it. So having the ability to see the totality of the issue, and therefore to be able to craft a response which addresses the totality of the issue. And so the psychopathology, the individual psychopathology, and the cultural trans, it's a seamless, it's woven as a single seamless robe at this stage. Chris, and then Brigitte. So one take, I'll get right back to you. Okay. You do? Yeah.
I was just going to comment from my, is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. I was going to comment from my near-death experience that in that experience, one of the teachings that I got was that in our lifetime, we operate from moment to moment. We have a choice between love and fear. And it's literally a moment-to-moment choice how you're going to react to somebody or something or some event. And who you are, who am I in that moment? And what am I bringing to that moment? Because that's going to affect everyone.
Totally. That's brilliant, Chris. It absolutely is. Yeah. Thank you, Olivia.
I'm just wondering.
Olivia,
I'm wondering how this hydra that Sean referred to, if we had to classify them, I would think that most of them are consciously misaligned. And what the question I'm asking is, when Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who hate you, and I hate them, I've been told, and I do believe it, that I have to make an effort to give them, to love them in a sense that I recognize the little bit of the divine, the tiny bit that is still in them. But the important thing to me is, if we do that, can it really, to what extent can we change them by loving them? Because if I thought I could, I would make a greater effort to love them.
Brilliant. Let me just make a quick response to that. It's brilliant. And so it's absolutely true. There is the divine in all. And we have to be able to relate to that piece, no matter how clouded it is, because it's clouded in all of us. It's only a question of degree. So it's clouded in all of us. So can I identify that piece and relate to it? That's the first point. The second point is, I have to love them. But there are 4 very different ways of loving. And confrontation is a very important way of loving. Yeah? It's not just you saying, whatever you do is okay with me, I don't mind, I know you're a child of God just like I am. Jesus confronted the iniquities of his time. So a way of loving is to confront. But it's not the confrontation that wants to consign somebody to hell for all eternity. It's the confrontation that disempowers people from continuing to, create havoc in our world. That's the second piece. And the third piece is this. In some extraordinary fashion, it is necessary that there be darkness in the world and that there be evil in our experience. In the absence of that, it would be literally impossible to develop free will, freedom, or compassion. If we lived in a world where there was absolutely no darkness whatsoever, literally our ability to be compassionate would atrophy. It would die on the vine. Our ability to be free would just wither up. And I've pointed out many times there's a big difference between freedom and free will. Free will is the ability to do as I please. Freedom is the ability to do as pleases God. So the only truly free person is the person who's choosing the good. To the extent that I'm not choosing the good, I'm subject to some kind of addiction or some kind of shadow material. So I'm not free if I'm choosing anything less than the good. But if there weren't choices among which to choose, there would be no possibility of making the transition from free will to freedom. And if there were no suffering in the world, there would be no opportunity of exercising compassion. So in some really convoluted fashion, I'm not saying, way on guys, you dark people, you evil guys, you've done a really good job for us, you've given us plenty of opportunity to exercise compassion. But evolution has happened in that fashion. We've gone from being, single-cell creatures to multicellular organisms, to creatures that didn't have any emotions whatsoever. Reptiles don't have any emotions, they don't dream, they don't have emotions, they don't raise their young, they lay eggs and then they're gone. We developed mammals, and the mammals had a limbic system which for the first time ever created beings on planet Earth that were capable of experiencing emotions and dreaming and raising their young. Mammals are committed to their young after they give birth to them. A snake or a serpent, will lay their eggs and that's it. That's their commitment to child raising. That's it. Lay eggs, bury them in the sand, see you later. So with the mammals came this new ability of emotions. Now the evolutionary complex is beginning to represent God even more and more nearly. Everything that exists is built in God's image and likeness, but not everything is a self-aware image of God. And so we're moving slowly towards that. With the development of reason, in Homo sapiens, 200,000 years ago, we had thinking beings who could rationalize their behavior. Latterly, we became self-reflective beings who can critique our own performances. So the trajectory is ever forward, moving us from free will. So most animals don't have free will, they're driven by instinct. So when free will came on the scene, it meant there was a possibility for extraordinary love or extraordinary anger or extraordinary oppression or extraordinary compassion. That was part for the course. There couldn't be compassion in the absence of choices among which to choose. And so it's a necessary part of the trajectory, which is not to say that the people who've signed up for being the dark, evil people, that we need to love them, but we need to appreciate that in some senses they're playing the picture. I shared with you, I was at Christmas, I had this really extraordinary dream on Christmas night after we'd finished a midnight mass here. I went home and we were having mass again next morning, and I had this extraordinary dream of jigsaw puzzles all night long. And in one of the jigsaw puzzles, it was clamped upright. The jigsaw puzzle was held upright. It was like suspended by some kind of magnetic field, and the pieces were on the table, but there were two pictures. There was a picture on the front and the picture on the back. And as I'm building the picture on the front, what's emerging is the face of Christ. But occasionally, as you know, when you're doing a jigsaw puzzle, there's a bunch of pieces left, and no matter where you try to put them, they don't seem to fit. You're wondering, what am I going to do now? And then I realized, if I went round to the other side, there was another picture on the back side of it. And this picture was the face of Satan. But what I realized was, I was getting clues from this side. When I didn't know where to put a piece on this side, and it was the same piece with two sides, if I went round to the back and figured, it goes in there. If I put it in from the back, it's also appearing on the front. And I got it that my own shadow is part of the jigsaw puzzle of life, that I have to work with my shadow material in order to develop the Christ consciousness, to bring out the face of Christ. And so my shadow is not totally my enemy, it's my friend. If it allows me to create the face of Christ by developing compassion, then it's my friend. And that's true as an individual, and it's true as the entire species. That in some senses, working with all the pieces on both sides of each piece give us clues as to how we can really manifest the face of Christ. Tom?
Just some ideas floating around, Sean. Okay. So these apparitions of Jesus that appeared after the resurrection, if you will, in what I would term people that loved him.
Yes.
So then in our current, day and age, if you lose a loved one, it's quite possible to experience that same type of apparition.
Absolutely.
And so, that's all grounded in, if you will, the deep love.
Absolutely.
So then my question really is, at times you speak about these portals or piercing through the thin veil to the other side, and I just wondered if there's a relationship going on there.
They're totally related, Tom. Totally related. So, for instance, in our Western model of body is a real impoverished model of body. You know, we think the body is a WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. That you look at a person and that's the body. You know, there's skin and there's flesh and there's muscles and ligaments and stuff like that, and that's it. You know, that's a really impoverished model of the body. Most other societies believed in at least a two-tier notion of body. You know, in Egypt called it Ka and Fravashi. So there's the kind of, there's the physical articulation and there's the metaphysical blueprint from which the physical body emanates. The Greeks had three totally different notions of body. They called sarx, the word they used. Sarx was the physical body, soma was the metaphysical body, and pneuma was the spirit body. And so in fact in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where he's talking about the resurrection of Jesus, and he's writing in Greek, he says, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. And the word he's using is sarx. Sarx cannot inhabit, this physical body cannot inhabit the kingdom of God. It's not about that. It's a different level of body. So he's talking about pneuma, the spirit body. But the Hindus did it best of all. The Hindus talk about 7 different levels of body. So there's the physical body, which is vibrating between 300 and 700 nanometers, infrared to ultraviolet. And when it dies, it's recycled molecularly. Inside that is a body which is vibrating at a higher frequency that they call the etheric body, the energy template. And that typically stays around, you know, the location of the physical body for many days afterwards. In fact, during the Easter Saturday night ceremony, I did a visualization about that. What was Jesus' etheric body doing for the 3 or 4 days after he died, or for the hours after he died? So the etheric body is the energy blueprint from which the physical body is subsequently composed. And that survives death by several days, and then it dissolves back into the universe as free energy. The third level of body they call the astral body, and that is the body that you actually inhabit every night when you dream. When you're dreaming and you have an experience of the self, you know, I did this and I was here and I saw this person and this person said this to me. Who's that I? That I is the, Hinduism will call it the astral self. So that's the body that allows you to experience yourself when you're dreaming and also in your emotions. And the belief system is that when the physical body dies and gets recycled and the etheric body escapes back into the universe as free energy, the astral body holds all of the experiences of the lifetime just finished. And they become available to you when you come back in, when you reincarnate. A fourth level of body, vibrating still higher, they call it the mind body or the mental body. And it's like Plato's ideal realm. It's the place from which we download ideation and cognition and ratiocination. You know, we're downloading from a higher level of the self. There's a fifth level they call the causal body, which is where we experience our abilities, our psychic abilities. At that level, we're all entangled. And so we experience, you know, telecommunication, we experience telepathy, clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, precognition, psychokinesis, all these things, because we're totally entangled at that level. And that level is the level at which all of the experiences of all the incarnations we've ever lived, there's a master archives that are held there. The sixth level of body they call Atman, which is individual soul. And then the seventh level is Brahma, which is cosmic consciousness. So when we're talking about Christ then, our beloved dead ones, what are we talking about? Very, very often the astral body has the ability to move between dimensions. And so the astral body very often will appear to us in our dreams because that's the level of body we utilize every night ourselves when we're dreaming. So it's very, very common to dream about the departed. And these are not just dreams. I told you one time about a very powerful dream I had in Palo Alto of my great-grandmother. She died in 1956, and she and I were really, really close. I was her first great-grandchild. But I had never dreamed about her for 37 years after she died. And then 1993, I'm living in Palo Alto, and I have a dream in which my great-grandmother comes to me, and she bent over me, and she looked like she was in her 30s, and kissed me, and she said a very strange thing. She said, "To me, I am." And I woke thinking, what in God's name does this mean? To me, I am? And it took me about a week to crack it. And I finally figured out what she was saying to me was, she was saying, I'm not just a dream fragment. I'm not just a memory from your past. I'm not just a figment of your imagination. To me, I am. I exist. I have an existence all of my own. And in fact, she's actually using the phrase that Christ would have used to identify himself. I am. Or that was used at the burning bush in Exodus 3:17, where Moses wants to know who this God is, and God says, Ahia, Ashir, Ahia. I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. So that's the phrase she's using. So she's telling me, I have an existence. So dreams are a very common way in which our loved ones actually visit us, because it's easier for them to get into an astral state than to get into a physical state. And we're already in an astral state if we're dreaming, so the medium is the same. Now sometimes in waking consciousness we can have those encounters as well. And I've had a few ghost experiences myself. And so most of us will have experiences where we feel the energy of, we see, we hear, or we know that the departed loved one, sometimes years gone, is around, and that there's some kind of interaction taking place. So, how real is that experience? The question I would ask is, how transformative is it? If it's transformative, it's real, it's true. Whether or not you can kind of convince other people, that, it really happened. If it transformed you and aligned you with Source, it was real. Yeah. Alfred.
Peter,
Yes.
naked,
Yes.
jumped into the ocean,
Yes.
into the sea
Totally.
with his clothes.
Totally.
Shows up later.
Yes.
He's counting the fish and
Yes.
so forth.
Okay.
I'm struggling, of course, with that metaphor, but what I see is myself frightened at the prospect of Christ appearing before me.
Right.
I turn and hide, I run, I jump, I hide. Eventually I may come back. Is that
Interesting.
what I should get from that? Or
Well,
is there
the real
something
story
more?
was that he jumped, he was naked, working in the boat. John says, there's the master. He looks, says, holy shit. It's him. And then he's naked, he puts on his clothes, dives into the water and swims ashore. So it's not that he's trying to hide. He actually swam to the shore. He got there before the boat. And I think that's the reason we made him the Pope. He's such a practical leader. Anybody who can think that clearly. Naked, put on your clothes and then jump in the water. Anybody who can think like that, they've got to be leaders. But the second part of the story is fascinating. Christ says to them, Christ is cooking some fish already. And he says to Peter, go back into the boat and take some of the stuff that you guys got. So that's a beautiful metaphor. So up to now, Christ has been feeding them. He's been feeding the Word of God. Now he wants them to start feeding themselves. So it's there's a transition. He's passing on the baton here. It's not just they don't have enough fish for the 8 of them. He's saying, it's a metaphor. I've been feeding you for the last 3 years. Now you need to learn how to feed each other. And the number, why do they say 153? Because in Greek taxonomy, the belief was there's 153 different species of fish on planet Earth. So it represents one of each species. So it's a message of the inclusivity, the global message that this kingdom of God is for everybody. It's not just for the Jews anymore. It's not for the elect. It's not for the 12 disciples. It's for all 153 of us, all the 153 different species of fish. Now, there's a lot more than 153 species, we know that. But that was the taxonomy at the time, 153. So it was hugely symbolic. It's about, this is a message meant for everybody. Everybody is included in the kingdom. Everybody is entitled to be fed. Yeah. Jerry.
I was curious because I happened to read, since I was reading, I read the Gospel too.
Ah, great, great.
And I noticed that you didn't read what it says in this book.
Yes, okay. Okay.
Because what it says is, he tied his cloak around him since he was stripped for work.
Yes, yes,
And so there's a commentary about that, which
Yes.
you're well aware of.
yes. Yes, the commentary is this. There are many, many, many different translations of all these texts. And every translation has an agenda. It's trying to push forward a particular belief system. So typically, there are 3 different ways of translating between language A and language B. And particularly when you're talking about biblical scholarship, there are 3 different techniques. The first technique is literal translation. You translate a verb with a verb, a noun with a noun, an adjective with an adjective. But it seems the best of all, but it gets you in problems really, really quickly. Because it is very, very difficult to translate metaphors meaningfully, or riddles, or puns. Puns don't translate. And so I remember one time, for instance, when I was living in Kenya, and a visitor, an American priest, came to visit, who was helping us to build a school. So I took him on safari with me. On a typical Sunday, I do 3 masses. So I took him on safari with me, and I invited him to address the congregation in each place. And I'd never met this guy before, and I asked him, you speak, and I'll translate for you. So he stood up, and he's given some kind of a speech, and at one stage, he used the phrase, you push my buttons. I think, holy fuck. I had no idea what push my buttons. I had never heard the phrase in my life. You push my buttons. Now, I'm living with people who don't wear clothes. They don't have buttons to begin with. They wear a cloak that's held with a cowhide thong. And I'm thinking, you press upon my cowhide thong? So how am I going to say? I had no idea what the guy meant. So when you're translating puns and metaphors, a literal translation doesn't work. So the way they translate the Bible typically is a system that they call dynamic transference. And dynamic transference is where you soak yourself in the kind of the geography of the time, the politics of the time, the kind of the history of the time, and soaking yourself in the culture, you now attempt to give the meaning of the original in the translated language. So you're trying to understand the mindset, the historicity, the geography, the puns, and then you try to create that context, for your new audience. And then the third one is where you start with an agenda, some kind of a theological agenda, and you force the scriptures to conform to your thinking. And this is a lot of Bible translations fall into this category, particularly the fundamentalist groups. They'll take a particular agenda, and they'll take a biblical passage, and they'll translate it to force it to say what they want it to say. Now, in the middle of all that, there's hundreds of different translations, and each group, each translator, has his own particular viewpoint, agenda, and prejudice. And so I'm well aware of this piece. This is a particular translation by a particular group of scholars, and they got a particular agenda there. And it's not one that I agree with personally, so I went back and I changed it as I read it to reflect the one that makes more sense to me. So thanks for catching that, Jerry. Okay, Lisa.
Part of this, the whole reading of what you were just talking about, the 150 Greek fish and recognizing Jesus, to me, this is actually a transference of work. So I know in my work with my staff, I have to look at, have I given them the tools and the training that they need to be successful? If I haven't done the tools, they can't be successful. If I haven't done the training, they can't be successful. So in this, it seems to me his being on the shore, coaxing them back with the fish is him saying, you've got everything you need. I am transferring the work here because you are equipped. This is my vote of confidence in you. I actually have faith in you now. That's
brilliant, Chris. That's excellent. Excellent. I love it. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Guys, it's 11:30. I'd love to stay talking about this all week. We better get on with Mass. Okay. So could we just take 5 minutes out and offer each other a sign of peace?